My name is Vanessa Cole. I'm 31 years old, and I watched my father tear a $22 million check into 4 pieces at my grandfather's will reading, drop them on the conference table like confetti, and tell me that some things weren't meant to be handed to people who hadn't earned them. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I picked up one of the torn pieces, looked at it for a moment and smiled. Because 3 days earlier, on a hunch I still can't fully explain, I'd asked my grandfather's attorney for a certified copy of that check, and it was sitting in a safe deposit box 12 blocks away. Before I tell you what happened after my father realized what he'd actually destroyed, tell me, what time is it where you're watching this from? I want to know how far this one travels. To understand why my father did what he did in that room, you have to understand what my grandfather Everett Cole actually built, and who he decided deserved a piece of it. Everett started with a single hardware store in Ohio in the 1960s and grew it, decade by decade, into a regional chain of building supply centers that eventually sold to a national retailer for an amount that made my family, on paper, extraordinarily wealthy. But wealth in our family was never distributed evenly. It was distributed according to a very specific, very old-fashioned idea of who deserved it. My father, Richard, was Everett's only son, and he'd spent 30 years running the company's logistics division. A real job with real responsibilities, but one my grandfather always described, a little dismissively, as keeping the trucks running. My father had inherited plenty already. A large stake in the sale proceeds, the family's original house, a seat on the foundation board. But he'd never inherited the one thing he actually wanted from his father, which was respect for being more than a manager. I was Everett's only granddaughter, and from the time I was 14 I'd spent summers at his side, not being taught to run trucks, but being taught to read a balance sheet, negotiate with a vendor, and understand why a business that treated its employees badly always eventually collapsed under its own resentment. I went on to build my own small logistics software company, the kind that automates the exact scheduling headaches my father's division had struggled with for decades. It grew quietly, then not so quietly. By the time my grandfather died, my company was profitable enough that I genuinely didn't need his money. I think that, more than anything, is what made him decide to give me some of it directly. Everett died in February. For months before that will reading, after a short illness he'd kept mostly private. His estate was substantial: the house, the foundation seat, various trusts for grandchildren, standard things a family like mine expected. What nobody expected was a single specific provision, added just 8 months before his death, leaving me a direct cash bequest of $22 million, separate from the family trusts, structured as an immediate distribution rather than something staged out over years. I didn't know about it until the reading. My grandfather and I had talked plenty in his final year about my business, about his regrets over how he'd raised my father, about what he called the difference between building something and just maintaining it. I understood later that this bequest was his way of saying something he'd never been able to say to my father directly, that competence and vision mattered more to him than bloodline alone. He hadn't told me because, as his attorney later explained, he didn't want me treating him differently in his final months, and he didn't want my father finding out early and turning what remained of his father's life into a fight. The will reading took place in a conference room at my grandfather's longtime law firm downtown. My father, my mother, my father's sister Diane, her husband, my 2 cousins, and me, seated around a long table while the attorney, a careful, precise woman named Miriam Castellano, worked through the document section by section. The early provisions were unsurprising: the house to my father and his sister jointly, the foundation seat continuing under family control, modest trusts for each grandchild set to distribute over the next decade. My father nodded through all of it, visibly relaxing, the way you relax when a will confirms exactly the order of things you already expected. Then Miriam reached the provision with my name on it, read the language aloud: a direct cash bequest of $22 million, to be issued immediately via certified check, no trust structure, no staged distribution, and produced the check itself from a sealed envelope, sliding it across the table toward me. The room went very quiet. My mother's hand found my father's arm before he'd even said anything, which told me she already sensed what was coming. My father picked the check up before I could reach it. He read it twice, his jaw working the way it did whenever he was building towards something he'd later regret. He gave her direct cash. Immediate. More than either of my own sisters, in one lump sum, with her name on it like she's the one who built this company. His voice wasn't loud yet, but it had the particular flatness of someone speaking through gritted teeth. Diane tried to say something conciliatory about how Dad always did things his own way. My father wasn't listening. She runs a scheduling app, he said, still holding the check, looking at me now instead of at it. I ran the division that moved actual product for 30 years, and my daughter gets $22 million because she wrote some code and had coffee with him a few times a month. He wasn't entirely wrong about the coffee. I had spent a lot of time with my grandfather. He was wrong about what that time had actually been. I said, carefully, that I hadn't known about the bequest, that I understood this was hard to sit with, but that it was Grandpa's decision to make. That was the wrong thing to say, or maybe there was no right thing to say. My father stood up, still holding the check, and said, some things aren't meant to be handed to people who haven't earned them. And then, in front of his sister, his brother-in-law, my mother, my cousins, and Miriam Castellano, he tore the check in half, then in half again, and dropped the 4 pieces onto the polished conference table. Here's the part my father didn't know, and the part that made it possible for me to sit there in front of everyone and simply smile instead of panicking. 3 days before the reading, I'd had a strange, hard-to-articulate feeling, not that something specific would go wrong, but a general sense, built from 31 years of watching my father's relationship with his own father, that whatever Grandpa had left me might become a flashpoint. I'd called Miriam's office somewhat sheepishly, and asked whether it would be possible to get a certified duplicate of any check made out to me before the reading, purely for my own peace of mind. She'd found the request unusual, but not improper. The original check was already drawn from an estate account, fully documented, and a certified copy with matching account and routing details, along with a formal letter confirming it as a valid duplicate instrument, was something her office could and did provide. I'd picked it up myself 2 days before the will reading, and put it directly into a safe deposit box at my bank, 12 blocks from where we were now sitting. I didn't request the copy because I suspected my father would tear anything up. I requested it because some instinct told me to protect the moment, whatever form the threat to it might take. Watching him rip the physical check into pieces, I felt something settle in me, cold and clear. He had just spent his anger on a piece of paper that meant nothing beyond its ceremonial value. The actual instrument, the one the bank would honor, was sitting safely 12 blocks away. So I smiled. Not to provoke him, I want to be honest about that, but because in that moment I understood something about my father that I don't think he understood about himself. His rage had always been performative, aimed at symbols rather than substance, and it had just, for once, cost him nothing real. I picked up one of the torn quarters, turned it over once in my hand, and set it back down. "Pay," I said. That was all. My father seemed thrown by my calm more than he would have been by tears or shouting. He said something about how I could take it up with the estate if I had a problem, his voice already losing some of its earlier certainty. Miriam, who had watched the entire thing without visible reaction, finally spoke. "Mr. Cole," she said, addressing my father with the specific, careful courtesy lawyers use when they're about to deliver bad news, destroying that instrument doesn't affect the underlying bequest. The estate will simply reissue the distribution. I'd also note, for the record, that what you just destroyed was witnessed by everyone in this room, which may be relevant depending on how you'd like to proceed from here. My father's face did something complicated. My mother, still holding his arm, looked at the 4 torn pieces on the table like they'd become radioactive. "Reissue it how?" my father asked. "The same way the original was issued," Miriam said. "Through the estate's account. Miss Cole will have her distribution within the week regardless of what happened here today." She paused, then added more gently, "For what it's worth, Mr. Cole, I'd encourage you to think about what you actually accomplished just now." I could have told the room right then about the certified copy sitting in my safe deposit box. Part of me wanted to watch my father's face rearrange itself around the fact that his gesture had been, in the most literal sense, symbolic theater rather than an actual act of financial sabotage. I decided not to. Not out of mercy exactly, but because I understood that saying it out loud in that room would turn a moment that was fundamentally about his relationship with his own father into a moment about me outsmarting him, and I didn't want the story of that day to become about my cleverness. I wanted it to be about what he'd actually revealed about himself. I collected my things, thanked Miriam, and left the 4 torn quarters of the check on the table. I didn't need them. I had somewhere safer they already lived. The estate reissued the distribution exactly as Miriam had said it would, deposited directly, no drama, No further paperwork required from me. My father called twice in the following month, both times to relitigate the same argument, that I hadn't earned it, that 30 years of running logistics deserved more recognition than a granddaughter's occasional company visits. I let him talk both times without much response because I'd learned watching him tear up that check, that he wasn't actually arguing with me. He was arguing with his own father, for months too late for his father to ever hear it. My mother told me privately, a few weeks later, that my father had gone back to Miriam's office and asked, almost sheepishly, whether the check he'd destroyed had been the real one. She told him yes, obviously. She had no reason to know about my safe deposit box, and neither did he until he read about it, possibly right now. When she relayed his reaction, she said he'd gone quiet for a long time, then said, I made a fool of myself in front of everyone for nothing. I didn't feel triumphant hearing that. I mostly felt tired, the way you feel tired after watching someone you love perform the same self-defeating scene you've watched them perform your whole life, just with higher stakes this time. I want to be honest about something because I think it matters more than the drama of the torn check. I didn't need that money. My company was already profitable, my life already stable. What my grandfather's bequest actually represented to me wasn't the number on the check. It was an old man, near the end of his life, finally saying out loud that competence and integrity mattered more to him than the accident of being his only son. My father heard that message as an insult to 30 years of his own labor. I understood it as my grandfather correcting something he regretted about how he'd raised his own children, being too hard on effort that didn't look like his own, too slow to recognize quieter kinds of contribution. I used a significant portion of that money to expand my company's apprenticeship program, hiring and training people from exactly the kind of working-class logistics backgrounds my grandfather started in and my father spent his career managing. It felt like the right use for money that had, in its own strange way, been about recognizing overlooked competence in the first place. My father and I still talk carefully the way people do after something has cracked that can't be fully uncracked. He's never apologized directly for tearing up the check, though he did, months later, admit that he'd been angrier at his own father than at me, and that I'd simply been standing in the blast radius of an argument that was 40 years old before I was born. I don't know if that counts as repair. I know it counts as more honesty than I'd gotten from him before that afternoon in the conference room. I still have the 4 torn quarters of the original check, actually. I went back for them before we all left the building that day, folded them into an envelope and kept them in a drawer at home. Not as a trophy. As a reminder that some people will destroy the symbol of your worth the moment it threatens their own story about themselves, and that the actual worth, if you've protected it properly, was never really theirs to destroy in the first place.